Rogation Sunday is an ancient celebration in our church calendar which takes place on the Sunday before we celebrate the Ascension, the day when Jesus returned to heaven. The Latin word rogare means to ask, to petition or beseech. On Rogation Sunday, we ask God to bless the earth, to bless the growing season that is coming. We live in an area that is rich in agriculture. The local apples are famous, and the rich earth of this area produces many crops that we depend on. Rogation is in many ways the Christian Earth Day. So if you learned about Earth Day or studied earth science in school, you'll have a pretty good idea why Christians celebrate Rogation Sunday. The gospel lesson we've just heard from Mark sounds very simple. It's about planting some seed and watching it grow. But it also contains some very profound and important lessons about God, the creator of heaven and earth, about the relationships we have to God's creation, and about the invitation God has given us to be part of the work of his kingdom here on earth. The gospel contains two separate parables which are linked by the same theme of natural growth. In the first, we see a picture of a farmer who plants seed in the ground. Over a period of days and weeks, the farmer gets up and goes to bed. The seed sprouts and grows and finally produces a harvest. Jesus points out that this process does not have to be controlled or even understood by the farmer to happen. The earth produces of itself, he says. Yet, when the harvest is ready, it must be harvested at once. Any farmer or gardener knows this. If you plant a kernel of corn or a complete ear of corn does not emerge from the ground. If you plant a tomato, a full-grown ripe tomato does not plop into your hands the next day. And if the farmer or the gardener waits too long to harvest the crop or pick the tomato, it will spoil, following the natural process of decay and of its own begin the cycle all over again. Jesus shows the special relationship that God has created in the harvest so that the fruit may be useful, so that humans may be partners in the benefit of God's creation. Consider this. Scientifically speaking, we may be able to understand photosynthesis, but we cannot replicate it. We know the biology of cell division, and farmers certainly know a great deal about the ways a crop can be genetically altered and fertilized and protected from all kinds of environmental damage. But we still can only work with the building blocks and elements of creation that we have been given. In this parable, Jesus points out that we are to be good stewards of God's creation. We stand in awe of God's ability to create, and we respond when God invites us to use our minds and intelligence, our instincts and awareness to use creation for our benefit, for the benefit of others, and for the benefit of the earth itself. In the second parable, Jesus points out that the process of growth always begins with something small, but given time, growth will come. He uses a plant that was familiar to his listeners. The mustard plant grows everywhere in the Holy Land. From one small seed comes a bush so large and bountiful that birds can live in safety and comfort. In another famous parable, Jesus tells his disciples that if they had faith the size of a grain of mustard seed, they could move mountains. This, of course, is not meant to be literal, yet humans have invented ways to move actual mountains in order to build homes and roads. In today's parable, the small seed stands in contrast to the large bush, which welcomes the birds as an encouragement to allow growth to occur in God's time and in God's way. Both of these parables are told by Jesus to illustrate what he called the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God was the central theme of Jesus' preaching and teaching, the core of his message. As baptized people, we become members of this kingdom, brothers and sisters of Christ and children of God. These parables tell us something about our journey of faith. The first parable helps to answer the question, what is God's will and what is my response? Jesus tells us right away that we are like the farmer. We are called to scatter the seed. Time and time again, Jesus sent out his disciples to preach and teach and heal. Jesus tells us that God gives the growth to the seed that we scatter. Like the farmer, we are to go about our daily business. Once the harvest is ripe, however, God asks us to bring in the harvest without delay. We must be bold and deliberate in witnessing to God's love. Harvest time is when the whole community works together. All ages, all abilities, all genders and races, everyone pulls their own weight so that all might eat and be sustained in the coming months. The second parable gives us encouragement, for it reminds us that doing God's will is not complicated. It starts with small things like a seed, and God gives great growth. Underneath these parables is an Easter story that is timely for this season. The day just before we celebrate the ascension of Jesus into heaven to sit at God's right hand. Jesus is telling us his own story. He is like the seed. And when we plant a seed, it looks dead. We bury it in the ground, and sometimes it takes what seems a long time to sprout. We can't see what's happening in the dark ground, but out of the dust of the earth comes growth, just like God made Adam from the dust of the earth. Jesus died and then rose again from the dead like a green sprout coming from the earth. An old hymn in our hymnal reminds us that love will come again like wheat that springeth green. The small mustard seed becomes a bush that shelters the birds of the air, just like the resurrection made the church possible. The church of Jesus is like a large bush coming from the one seed of Christ's sacrifice. The church reaches out its branches to welcome all who are seeking shelter, a place to belong, a place to make a nest of safety and security. There is finally a word of caution in these parables, and the word is this: God's kingdom will come with or without our help. Just as a tree can split a rock, or a blade of grass can find the place in a crack of stone, just like the natural world has been here long before humans walked the earth, and the resurrection of Jesus was not our doing, but was God's. So the kingdom will come, and God will continue to reach out to welcome all people into his loving arms. If we are lazy or careless farmers, if we neglect the growth of our spiritual lives or allow our faith to wither away, or refuse to join the community in the harvest will spoil. We may not be able to create life, but God has allowed us the power to neglect and spoil the natural world, as well as the power to refuse to plant the seed of life into our lives and the lives of others. I have a little book that was given to me many years ago called Down to Earth: Thoughts on God and Gardening. It is a series of meditations on the various aspects of gardening and how they relate to our Christian life. In the chapter on the garden, the author writes the following: A garden, whether formal or natural, must be cared for. And even those natural plantings are not so easy to maintain as they look. The weeds that Jesus spoke about, the weeds of worldly care and desires and frustrations, must all be pulled out. Of course, no gardener would expect his flower beds to weed themselves, but God does expect it of us because we have both hearts and minds. And as there are many different types of flowers, so there are many different types of Christians. What a dull garden it would be with nothing but marigolds. A person who has learned to love God must be constantly telling or showing it in 100 ways, and these, if you like, are flowers. They express God's goodness to us and they show forth his glory. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Like the fruit of nature, it does not appear at once when the blossom leaves, nor all the same time. In fact, when the first radiance goes away, we're hardly aware that anything is left. But as time grows on, the first green fruits become visible. It is not yet time for the harvest, but at least we know they are growing. The important thing is for us to refuse to be discouraged by what looks like a setback. We too must be persistent until we bear fruit. These times might feel like a setback. We cannot yet open our lovely church for public worship. Many businesses are still closed and small business owners are struggling. Parents are faced with squirrely children and very few options for the summer. The message of rogation is one of asking God for his mercy, guidance, and protection. The risen Christ has given us the seed of his word and asks us to spread it to others. He invites us to gather the harvest of souls that are seeking his truth and his love. He encourages us in our daily lives in the small acts of goodness and words of kindness. Finally, Jesus shows us a picture of the church, like a bush with branches spread wide, like Jesus' arms of love spread on the cross, welcoming and sheltering all whom God calls. The branches of digital worship are blooming with new life. The branches of outreach and caring still shelter those in need. God invites us to be his good stewards, stewards of the created world, stewards of his word, stewards of his church, so that from small seeds of mercy, love, and compassion, the fruit of the Spirit emerges and a harvest of souls is gathered. Amen.